Got a very special guest here in studio with me. Dean Reuter is back on the show, General Counsel and Vice President and Director for Practice Groups, the Federalist Society, one of my favorite groups, if not my favorite group in Washington, D.C., best known these days for helping the president, I think, vet some of his incredible justice and judge picks, which have been exemplary and quite numerous across the board. So smart, hardworking guys and gals, and we like them very much here in Breitbart land. But today we're here to talk about his book that he has out now. We spoke about it briefly a few weeks back, and I've since consumed the book. I've read it and enjoyed it very much, and I learned a ton, and I was shocked quite regularly. The Hidden Nazi is what it's called, The Untold Story of America's Deal with the Devil. Incredible title, too, by the way. Dean, great to have you on the broadcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, having me back, actually. I appreciate it.
Yes, and it's a worthwhile cause, and I am actually stunned at what I read in the book, because we were talking about a guy, Hans Kammler, who is arguably top 5, maybe top 2, maybe top 3 most the murderous Nazis, most effective Nazis, for lack of a better expression. And we know almost nothing about him until your book. Let's go from the start. How did you get involved with it, and what did you uncover?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. I was approached 12 years ago by a friend I knew from college who came to me as a lawyer and a friend to write a collaboration agreement for him. He had been researching other aspects of World War II, came upon this all-powerful, all-evil Nazi general Hans Kammler, and in doing his research, he also came across another researcher in Northern Ireland, Colin Lowry, and he wanted me as a lawyer to draft a collaboration agreement so the two of them could share information. And I did that pro bono, I would add, as a friend.
Sure.
And he started telling me this story in broad strokes, and I was incredulous, really. I couldn't believe it. I was very skeptical.
Yes.
And he just gave me bits and pieces. They had an author in mind for their project. As they grew close, they started sharing information. And they had somebody lined up that didn't work out. I started doing a little bit of research on my own. They started feeding me documents and bits and pieces. And the story became more and more compelling. As you said, shocking things in the story.
Shocking. It does read like fiction in many parts. And it starts with, if you just go through the biography of Hans Kammler, he even had children who died due to gas consumption, or I guess gas exposure, and then he ends up becoming one of the people who made the Nazi concentration camps and their massive amounts of murder via gas chambers more efficient. Incredible.
Yes. Yeah, well, he's the guy who identified Auschwitz as the place for the biggest camp, and then he designed Auschwitz, including the metes and bounds, the irrigation system, the roadways. He even designed the standard concentration camp barracks, and Underling had proposed brick barracks, and he said, no, we're going to do a standardized wooden barrack that's going to be used here at Auschwitz, but throughout the Reich, at all the concentration camps. And he became known for these efficiencies, standardization in processes and materials and designs that just make sense in the modern world. But for killing machinery, it's really tragic. So he designed these concentration camps, not just at Auschwitz, but throughout the Reich. And I'm going to make clear, he was a hands-on sort of guy. He wasn't doing this from Berlin, from some bureaucratically safe place. He was on the ground. We have document after document show him weekly, daily visits to these camps. He had a nickname, actually, Staubwolk, which means dust cloud, which describes his sort of frantic pace going from one camp to another, making sure everything was just so. And that was just building out the camps. Then he turned to the gas chambers and the ovens.
When was the first moment, what was the first revelation where you thought that you really are perhaps hitting on something that is truly spectacular in the negative sense? I mean, but it's when you realize that this is some significant history that has just not been uncovered before.
Yeah, it was actually learning about his role in the Holocaust. I thought we knew everything we needed to know about the Holocaust. I thought that everybody who was responsible in any significant way had been identified. But yet here is this hugely powerful guy who was integral. I mean, he literally made the Holocaust possible, because not only did he design these camps, as I mentioned, he went on to design and then install the gas chambers and the ovens. And he's the guy who decided, we're going to have a gas chamber in the basement near the railroad tracks that approach the camp, because it's the infirm, the elderly, the children that they're gassing first. So make it as efficient as possible. And then we'll have an elevator upstairs to the crematoria to reduce the distance that the corpses had to be traveled.
Yeah, that was a part where I shuddered when I read that about how he designed that specifically to make it so that it was the least amount of effort to get the dead bodies out of the chambers and into the crematoria is just. You can't picture a level of evil at that level.
It's heartless. It's terrible. Really aberrant behavior. But that's what was called for in that regime, and he perfected it. So he continued to rise through the ranks, and rise in power and authority. And he was one of these guys who. Before the war, he was just doing sort of mundane architectural and construction projects, but he never gave anything up. He just added to his portfolio.
Yeah, it's described in the book as the Henry Ford of concentration camps.
Yeah, he did for concentration camps and mass killing what Henry Ford did for automobiles in terms of mechanizing it, standardizing it, and making it grossly efficient. Okay, so I'm gonna tease it. Later on, we'll get into a little bit, and again, people have to read the book. The book is The Hidden Nazi, The Untold Story of America's Deal with the Devil. It's got 3 authors, Combe Lowry, Keith Chester, but I'm with Dean Reuter, who you get first billing here. You get your name in big print on the cover from the Federalist Society, and we're getting into this. And later on, we're going to get into why he's remained a mystery. There's a lot of logic to that too, but I want to talk a little bit about his background some more. So not only was he the architect of the gas chamber, not only is he someone who systematized the extermination of the Jews, but he was also someone who was heavily involved in their V-2 rocket program. Describe this. Sure. So after World War I, we had the Treaty of Versailles, which restricted Germany's ability to implement anything militarily. It didn't mention rockets. So during the interwar period in the 1930s, early 1930s, they started developing rockets. And Wernher von Braun was their lead rocket scientist. They had a lot of successes. They ended up building 100 different rocket models during the war. A couple of them, which we detail at great length in The Hidden Nazi. One was these are the vengeance weapons, as they became known, because they were used to retaliate against England for bombing German cities. It's vengeance weapons. The V1 was the buzz bomb. It was not a high-tech bomb, a rocket. It was basically a pilotless aircraft, flew at about 400 miles an hour, diesel-powered, but still rained down terror on the citizens of London and Southampton and Antwerp. Very effective. They launched tens of thousands of them at England. And the other, which was really revolutionary, was the V2. This was the liquid-fueled supersonic rocket that so advanced it looked like it didn't really belong on a World War II battlefield. If you can bring to your mind the equipment of World War II, this was a 46-foot rocket, 16 tons, flew to a height of 55 miles through the atmosphere. Wow. At 3,600 miles an hour. So, and to give you some comparison, your listeners' comparison, standard commercial aircraft fly at about 6 miles, not 55 miles, and at about 600 miles an hour maximum, not 3,600 miles an hour. So this V2 would it would arrive before its auditory signature. It was supersonic, so there was no warning. You'd just be walking down the street and the city block would just be shattered. And it would create a crater and dislodge 2,000 tons, equivalent of 2,000 automobiles, just shrapnel and dirt and wreckage everywhere. Did the Allies have an answer for it? They had no defenses. Once it was launched, there were no defenses to it. You couldn't interrupt it. You couldn't interfere with it. We had no radio jamming. These were radio controlled. The Allies did have some successes in trying to interrupt the supply chain, and they had mobile launching vehicles for these rockets. Teams of 5,000 people would go out, set up a rocket, and launch it, and then move on to their next site. So before it landed, they were gone. So there were almost no defenses other than there were some interesting intelligence gambits where they released in newspapers that these rockets were landing beyond London. And the Germans read these news accounts, and then they shortened the range on these because one thing they didn't have was a way to track the impacts of these. So, and what was Kammler's role in the V2? So the rockets were developed by rocket scientists, and they enjoyed high priority at times, then low priority, then high priority. It was a struggle to get them together. These were technological marvels that required thousands of intricate pieces and new technology all working together at once. Albert Speer described it as the planning of a miracle. And they had a successful launch in October 1942, and Kammler and Himmler, as was their ploy, they reached out and grabbed that program, made it their own. So it was Kammler then who ran that program from that point forward. Once they had a successful test program, he's the guy who took over the research, the production, the development, and even deploying it in the field. He's the guy that stood by these launch tables, picked targets, and then launched the rockets on London and in Southampton.
So he's essentially running a team of rocket scientists, and he's the guy who systematized the killing machines at Auschwitz. So already we're talking about clearly a very driven individual.
Oh, yeah. No doubt about it.
Could you contextualize this? Because this is something that, I mean, it's dark. There's something darkly almost. It's just so surreal to think of someone who ran concentration camps as being particularly ambitious. But that's the way Kammler comes across in the book.
He was. I mean, it's a bizarre system that he excelled in. And he was a technocrat. I mean, German efficiency is sort of a phrase. He became an expert at it. He got noticed early on for doing mundane projects. And then as they needed more and more horrible things, he's the guy they turned to. And he was so ambitious, he just managed to get everything done. His peers marveled at him, but by the same token, they feared him. His colleagues thought they'd be shot if they didn't perform to his standards.
So I think his equivalent that I think would be more well known to my audience appears to be Heinrich Himmler. Do you consider, did they, and they seem to have a bit of a rivalry as well?
Yeah, they were. I mean, at first, Kammler was subordinate to Himmler until the very final days of the war, but they were really a pair. They had the same MO where they would see a project or a person who was on the rise and they would give them an SS rank and make them their own. And from that point forward, that person and that project belonged to the SS. So
this is remarkable. So Himmler, who's been a household name for decades and will be, Kammler unknown until this book. And we're going to get into why that is. But I do want to ask, there's even a consideration in the book that he was arguably scarier than Hitler. Is that possible? Could you be more ruthless?
I think so. I mean, yes, I'll say yes to that. I mean, Hitler was a mastermind. He was a psychopath. I think probably Kammler was as well. But there were things that we found that Kammler was willing to do that Hitler was not. And I'm talking about things that went beyond, like the use of chemical and biological weapons, the possible use of nuclear weapons. Hitler didn't want to use those. It's clear that Kammler, without Hitler's knowledge, was working in that direction, sort of behind the scenes, in secret.
Okay, so I think you guys have got a chance to meet Hans Kammler, for lack of a better expression. And again, I recommend the book highly. It's one of the most important histories that I've read, The Hidden Nazi, The Untold Story of America's Deal with the Devil. Dean Reuter, one of the authors, the primary author, is with me from the Federalist Society, a group we love on Breitbart News. And let's talk about the why. The why is, I think, the part that is the most instructive in some ways. How has he gotten away with it? How come he is not a household name? And it comes down to who could use the knowledge and insight that he had, and that's us, the United States.
Yeah. No. Well, very clearly, we ended up benefiting. Everybody could have used that knowledge. I mean, and you know, if you think back to the World War II, your listeners probably remember that it was known pretty far in advance that the Germans were going to lose the war. And there was going to be this mad scramble for this technology, not just the rocket technology, but all sorts of other technology, and for gold and for treasure. There was lots of bounty to be found as the German Reich contracted and the Soviets approached from one side and the Western Allies approached from the other. But this rocket technology was particularly attractive because it was so high tech. Everyone knew rockets were going to be the future of warfare. And whoever ended up with this rocket team, and it's not just one or two rocket scientists, these are hundreds of people that made up this rocket team. Whoever ended up with them would rule the world. And indeed, we got the best of the best. We ended up on the moon first, and we ended up with the ICBM, and I think winning the Cold War because we got the rocket team.
So it's your suspicion, and there's some documentation to suggest this, that the United States cut a deal with Kammler. So his death was faked, as far as we know.
Yeah.
Your research, it suggests he probably ended up somewhere in South America, but describe the circumstances and describe the details, because again, this is somewhat of an open question. Where did he end up? How did he get to South America? What did we do with his knowledge that we were able to extract?
Sure. Yeah. One thing I'd point out that I found was interesting. We were competing for the knowledge not just with the Soviets, but with our Western allies, with Great Britain and France. So it was clear we wanted it all for ourselves, and I'm glad we got it, frankly. But conventional history is that Hans Kammler committed suicide on May 9th, 1945, literally the days the war is ending.
Yes.
That was reported by his driver near Prague in Czechoslovakia. But by this time in the war, he's an Obergruppenführer, which is the highest commissioned rank in the SS. And nobody ever returned his identity disc, his sidearm, or his paperwork, which is standard practice, required practice in the war. No body was ever produced. Post-war searches for a gravesite turned up nothing. So it was very suspicious. This is like, he's the equivalent in rank to George Patton. So it's like losing George Patton in the field of battle. It's just unthinkable. It didn't happen. So people started to look around. There were other versions of his death. And our researchers...
Well, but this is interesting. There are many accounts of how he died. So this is I think there are too many to count almost.
Yeah, there are. They sort of bleed together, but they all differ in location or means of death. Most of them are suicides. Some of them are, he died in a hail of gunfire, defending his troops, that sort of thing. But what's clear is each one is inconsistent with the other, and raises lots of suspicion. And Keith and Colm, my colleagues and researchers on the project, dug and dug and dug. And this is not contested. There's no doubt about this. He did not commit suicide. He actually surrendered to the U.S. Army. The documents we have there are very clear.
Wow.
What became of him a year later is less clear.
How common was it for the United States to cut deals with Nazis, even the most heinous Nazi criminals, and in order to get their knowledge?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this goes back to the geopolitical context at the time. Everybody knew Germany was going to lose. The Soviet Union was going to be the new enemy, and indeed an existential threat. We feared them. The Germans had been fighting them for years. So we started recruiting Nazis who had intelligence networks, who knew how to fight the Soviets. We recruited dozens and dozens and dozens of them. Many of them, had tortured people, imprisoned people, killed people, ruled over 1-minute trials that were fake trials and then executed people. None of them, though, I think, had the breadth of killing that Hans Kammler did. So some of them were concentration camp. They were just as bad, probably, in terms of moral compromise, but they didn't operate on such a broad platform.
Tell me about Project Hermes.
Project Hermes was a contract that the Americans struck with General Electric, our big, industrial giant, General Electric. And this is one of the things that leads us to believe there was a deal with Kammler. So in October of 1944, about 8 months before the war ends, the United States enters into a contract with General Electric under Project Hermes to build a V-2 type rocket.
Yes.
In November and December, emissaries of Hans Kammler are meeting with not just American officials, but General Electric officials at the Lisbon German embassy in Portugal, neutral territory. That's where we think Kammler cut his deal with the Americans to turn over this technology. In January, the rocket team, 4,500 rocket scientists, had been operating in northern Germany throughout the war. The Soviets are approaching in January. January 31st, with his deal in hand, Kammler signs an order to move the rocket team to central Germany to a special purpose-built underground facility he had made with slaves, killing tens of thousands of slaves in the process. So the rocket team's now in central Germany. In February, there's the Yalta Conference.
Yes.
At which it's, the Allies are dividing up responsibility for post-war Europe, and they're defining the zones of occupation. And it turns out this site that Kammler just moved the rocket team is going to be in the Russian zone of occupation. So he's been thwarted. So he signs another order and moves the rocket team a second time down to Bavaria, literally within a week's march of the advancing U.S. Army. So it's clear to us that he made these movements, which were extraordinary and very difficult to do, in order to hand the rocket team over to the United States.
Unbelievable. So we're literally talking about arguably the second most murderous Nazi cutting a giant deal to move his rocket team to help specifically General Electric in the United States. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah, I would say specifically the United States, and General Electric was our contractor, and they benefited from having the rocket scientists. There's no doubt if they had to start at ground zero in terms of the research, we would have been 15 years behind.
Certainly. No, I'm not judging. I'm just noting the history. It's incredible. People can cast their own judgment, and you should read the book. Again, The Hidden Nazi is what it's called. Dean Reuter is my guest. Dean, whose day job is at the Federalist Society, got involved in a project to uncover details about Hans Kammler, one of the most efficient monsters in human history, as far as we know. He was a general in Nazi Germany who was not only involved in systematizing the extermination of the Jews in the Holocaust, but then also presided over the V-2 rocket program, which was a very advanced way of delivering high-powered explosives to attack Allied targets. And then he cut deals with the United States so he would get the technology. As far as we know, he made his way down to South America, where he embarked on starting perhaps a Fourth Reich. We don't know. Some of the details are in the book, and you should pick it up and read it. Let's talk about that, Dean. The possibility of a Fourth Reich, another moment where it sounds like I'm reading some sort of a paperback novel, but this is real.
Yeah. I think I mentioned that at the outset of this project, I was skeptical. And one pattern that emerges in The Hidden Nazi in the book is my researchers and colleagues, Keith and Colm, kept bringing me these new theories and new threads to the story. And every one of them, they just seem more and more remarkable. But this does seem like science fiction or something like that, the Fourth Reich. But we found solid evidence. There was a meeting in the fall of 1944 with high government German officials and German industrialists, a lot of companies that you'd recognize their names today. And the takeaway from that meeting, the orders to the German industrialists were to take all your technology and all your treasure and offshore it, get it out of the Reich, preserve it for later, for a resurgence. And it makes a lot of sense when you stop and think about the arc of history. Your readers, your listeners, rather, probably remember that World War I ended extremely suddenly for the Germans. They were supposed to win. They thought they were going to win. They'd never fought a battle even on German soil, and all of a sudden they surrender. And yet, after a period of time, after a period of suffering under the Treaty of Versailles, they go on to World War II and conquer more territory, vastly more territory than they ever conquered in World War I. So this idea of a cycle of resurgence seems very possible given the German psyche, and they certainly planned for it. On an individual basis, they planned for it too. We found that individual Nazis were planning their own exit strategies well. Sure,
they were cutting their own deals. They were stealing gold.
Right. They were getting out of the country. And we also found a 1953 CIA report that reads like an alarm bell. The CIA was in Argentina documenting what had happened down there. Enclaves of German villages. They said it was like Bavaria. German chambers of commerce, restaurants, highly talented people down there. The CIA in the early 1950s was terrified of a Nazi resurgence.
So who else was down there? Do we know of any other big-time Nazis who were down?
Well, Eichmann was down there. Mengele was down there. There are some others that are missing and unaccounted for. I don't think any as big as Hans Kammler. In fact, I write in the book, The Hidden Nazi, if it was known that Hans Kammler had survived, I think he would have been number one on the most wanted list. Yeah,
that comes clear in the book that it appears like that would be number one. So do we know what happened to him? Do we know because we know the Fourth Reich, thank God, never has found its footing, at least not yet. But what became of him?
So there are some difficulties in trying to figure it out. We have traced him to March of 1946. So 8 months after the war, we had him. 10 months after the war, the United States had him in custody. We interrogated him about various things in various places in northern Austria, in central Germany, on the eve of the Nuremberg trial in Nuremberg. And I think we got everything we could from him. And then in the book, The Hidden Nazi, we spin out 3 different scenarios. And we're very clear at that point, we're sort of speculating based on our best evidence. He might have gone to the United States. That's sort of the worst case, most frightening scenario for most of our readers.
Wow.
He could have stayed on the continent with aid from the United States. But what we deem the most likely scenario is he went to South America with assistance from the United States. And we come to that conclusion and back it up, I think, really well, based on other known cases. There were other cases that became known. One in particular, Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon. He's as bad as you can get, but again, operated in a small scale in terms of his geography during the war. At the end of the war, the Army CIC, Army Counterintelligence Corps, U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps, recruited him as an intelligence asset because he knew the Soviets. We used him for years as an intelligence asset. The French wanted him. He'd already been tried in absentia and found guilty and sentenced to death. So we're using a capital criminal, a war criminal, as an intelligence asset. The French wanted him. We wouldn't give him over. And finally, the political pressure got so high that we shipped him to South America.
And this is something that we touched on a bit last segment, but this is much more common than I had thought, and I've read a fair bit about World War II history. I've always been interested in it, but I wasn't aware to the extent to which even high-level, or maybe even especially high-level Nazis, where we worked with them, and they were able to move on, have a second life, working with the United States. A guy you write about named Von Braun, who seemed like he was worse than Hitler in some ways, working for years with the United States, and as if nothing had ever happened, it appears.
Yeah, well, Von Braun came to the United States, became an American hero, really. Worked with Walt Disney, started our rocket program, helped us get to the moon.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, and we brought hundreds of folks to the United States, and some of them were, just benign actors, honestly. Many of them were ardent Nazis, though, and we had a way of cleansing their records, ignoring their past, making a moral calculation that we needed them to, win the Cold War, essentially.
So a lot of the book, which I haven't detailed a lot, but you'll get it if you read it, and you should, the book's The Hidden Nazi, the untold story of America's deal with the devil, that devil being Hans Kammler, is some of its personal memoir, because this has been a saga for you to get through this amount of material. It's very interesting to get all of it. And I imagine that you contacted the government a number of times. You would rely on a lot of reports that would rely on the United States either helping or not helping. Did you run into a lot of cases where you felt like you'd figured out where an answer would be, and you weren't able to get the correct documentation because the United States would not allow for it?
Yeah, so some of that, yes. The quick answer to that is yes. Some of that was benign, I think. Some of it is disorganization in the records. At the end of the war, it's like everybody just put everything in boxes and came home. But there were two central agencies in this story. One is Army CIC, the Counterintelligence Corps, which I just mentioned. And there's one particular unit of that, geographical unit of that we were concerned with. Their records from 1945 to 1947 are gone. They just do not exist, we're told. Another organization that's central is OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was the precursor to the CIA. At the end of the war, 5 million pages of their documents were destroyed. So the search for documents is very difficult.
Wow.
But there's some modern elements to this as well. A lot of the documents we got were from archives and obscure libraries, military bases, a lot from FOIA requests. And my colleague Keith Chester made a FOIA request, got an answer back. This is in 2012, and it's been renewed since. That they had two documents responsive to Kammler. One from 1969, 35 pages. One from 1987, 87 pages. 45 years after the war ends, they're still making massive documents about Hans Kammler, and they wouldn't even produce redacted versions of those documents. A lot of times you'll get 35 pages, and a lot of it will be blacked out. They would give us nothing. And
Unbelievable.
And then when Keith made a follow-up request, I said, you got to do a follow-up request on this. He made a follow-up request to the same office, and they said, no such documents.
Unbelievable. So all of this, again, the why is always the most interesting question. Why is this the case? And I think the connective tissue is that the United States was, I think, largely justifiably more concerned about communism than Nazism. After vanquishing the Nazis in World War II, which the Allies did, then the concern immediately shifted towards communism, which is, in many ways, to this day, is still our fight. Because if you believe, as I do, as a student of what's going on in China, that Stalinism and Leninism is very much part of the Chinese system and worldview. So this is why we cut all these deals. Could you expand on that and talk a little bit about your views, if you'd like, but more the United States perception about communism versus Nazism at that moment?
Sure. Yeah, it was. I think you've there's nothing you said there that I disagree with. I think you got it. You nailed it. Long before the war is over, we realized the next enemy would be communism, the Soviet Union, and they were an existential threat. Their view of the world and their desire for world domination exceeded that of Germany's. Hitler, for all his faults, thought of the United States as a post-war power. He had these maps in his mind. It would be him and the United States, and maybe something carved out for Great Britain and France. But the Soviet Union is completely incompatible with the United States. Everybody realized that. That was the fear, and that's why we started recruiting all these people. And, I don't disagree with what you said about the modern political landscape either. So
let's talk a little bit about some of your, you've been involved in fighting Holocaust denial in the past, which is, for some reason, even though it seems, as far as I know, one of the most well-documented mass events in human history, there is still a strain of people who are not entirely delegitimized, even though they believe that the Holocaust was all some sort of giant conspiracy, which is, I think a lot of it is trolling, to be honest. I think a lot of people don't genuinely believe that, but I think a lot of people genuinely, that is a pervasive thing. And when you literally have Nazis boasting about killing at Nuremberg, and you have all these documents that you've uncovered. Do you have any, you've given this a lot more thought than I have over the years. Talk to me a little bit about Holocaust denial, why it's still a part of our life, and what are your thoughts?
So I think there's a couple ways to look at it. One is that it's just so massively terrible, it's hard to wrap your head around it. I mean, when you think of the numbers of people and the motivations for killing people and committing genocide, it's difficult to comprehend. And so maybe a first reaction is just to say no to that. However, I think some people want to make a political issue out of it. They want to divide people. That's their MO. I think that motivates people nowadays. One of my big concerns, frankly, was just not necessarily overt denial, but just ignorance, a lack of information. People, 30 years old and younger don't really know much about the World War II. It's an abstraction for them. And I tried in The Hidden Nazi, in the book, to make that very real. And there are some accounts in there, some individual stories that I think make for tough reading. But I put them in there because they are so real. And I wanted to put some faces on the Holocaust, both on the perpetrator side, but on the survivor side and the victim side.
So just to put a bow on this, and again, Dean Reuter is with me in the book. It's a must-read, The Hidden Nazi, The Untold Story of America's Deal with the Devil. How does the Holocaust differ? How does World War II change? How does the future change if Hans Kammler is not a part of it?
Wow. I think today the geopolitical landscape would look vastly different. If we, the United States, did not get the rocket team, we did not do the Kammler deal. I'm glad we did it.
Unbelievable.
I don't second guess the fact that we did the deal. It's troubling in ways, but I don't think we would have won the Cold War. It was common knowledge this rocket team came to the United States. It's not common knowledge that Kammler's the one that delivered them.
What do you make of the fact that the cover-up, which is, I think is probably, from the sound of it, sounds like you think has a lot of merit to it, but the United States, our cover-up of this extremely high-ranking Nazi that has been, 7-8 decades later, you're uncovering him. What do you make of that? It seems almost impossible to cover this up for this long.
It does, especially with what I know about Washington. There's the old saying, if the best way to keep a secret in Washington is to limit to two people, one of whom is dead. It's impossible to keep a secret in this town, but I think a lot of it at this point is just inertia. And it was really scrubbing the records. Scrubbing the records and destroying records. We talked to one archivist, another researcher talked to one archivist who said, it's as if somebody's come in and cleaned up the records. And
no one has approached you and said that you got it. I was waiting for someone to break this.
No. Like a sort of a whistleblower type thing. No. I think there was a very active cover-up for 10, 20, 30 years even. And then beyond that, it's just sort of the momentum of the thing. The documents are gone. I don't think there's anybody in government right now who's protecting things for their own account. I think there are some people who are we don't declassify documents. That's an intelligence document. Well,
you approach this in a very scholarly way, which I love, and I talk about scholarship a bit on the show because I do feel like a lot of the country is getting redefining what scholarship is supposed to be about, and just announcing certain things have been proven that haven't been proven. It's a frustration across the board. But you've suggested that your research already, and it's a substantial book, is probably begs more questions than it answers in some ways. And so you would like to continue with this work. If people want to get in touch with you, and we know we have a lot of Washington-based listeners, if people have other documents or questions, where can people find you if you because you're going to continue this research?
We are. And it's my hope, frankly, that somebody has a box of documents in their attic and they remember their Uncle Joe said, oh, Hans Kammler did this or that. Because we found documents in obscure places, small libraries and military bases. So I think there are more documents out there. People can reach me at deanreuter@gmail.com.
Okay.
Or through my publisher, Regnery History.
Okay, we are wonderful, and thanks to Regnery for putting this out. So important, really, one of the books of the year for me, and I hope everyone picks it up, The Hidden Nazi, The Untold Story of America's Deal with the Devil. Dean Reuter, incredible, my friend. Come back anytime you'd like.
Thanks so much for having me on, Alex.